Okay, hi everybody. I'm gonna just get situated a little bit better here. This chair is actually not close enough. Kind of in a weird spot. There's definitely still a lot of people joining too. So let me just make sure this is streaming on YouTube. Just because that's kind of a new thing for us to try. So I just want to make sure it's going. Okay, looks like it is. Good. I'm not going to be able to see the comments there in real time because I need to use my phone for something else. So during this, if you are writing to us there, then we'll get to your. I'll make sure to take a look, and we'll get to comments afterwards. Okay, and then still letting folks get here. I see a lot of people still joining. So I'm going to get my phone so I can see it. And then I'm also going to hit recording. Okay, and actually I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and then I'll bring that back in a minute. But hi everybody. Happy October 2020. My name is Caitlin Sabosi Belknap. I moved to Amend's National Director, and I'm going to do this presentation here tonight and have this conversation with you. And I have to say that when we first started talking about doing this, it was like many months ago, but I've had to move around a bit, which is a weird thing to do during coronavirus, but to be closer to my family. So long story short, it kind of took a while for us to get this scheduled and find a time that would work. And actually, we're leaving for Arizona. I'm in New Mexico right now. I'm in Santa Fe, where I grew up. I normally live in Sacramento. And we're leaving for Arizona to be there indefinitely while my mom is going to wait for a lung transplant. So there's just like a lot going on. And obviously, there's also a lot going on in the world right now. So I just want to say, first of all, that I am not here because I have the plan for what we should do about this moment, but there's some things that I want to talk to you about that Move to Amend national folks have been talking over and is happening in conversation, in a lot of places, like what do we do? So I have some thoughts, and I think we also we at Move to Amend have some unique and then also relevant and useful information based on what we have been doing for the last 10 years. And in my case, I have been working against corporate constitutional rights and corporate rule for this will be 20 years for me, coming up on 20 years. So we've just been at this for a while, and some of my colleagues have been doing this longer than I have. So I just realized that my name says that I moved to Amend, and I kind of want to switch that just so that it's a little bit more personal. I didn't really realize that was there. So let me just fix it real quick. I'll just, you don't need my whole spelling of my last name. All right. So this will also be recorded. So if you have to leave early, or are having technical difficulties, you could try hopping over onto YouTube, which I think is working fine. There's a few Move to Amend staff folks who are also tuned in and could potentially help, although at the moment I'm the only one who can see your chats. So, but you can message me through Q&A, and then you could also message me through chat. And actually, I'm going to turn on the chat so that everyone can see it, so you guys can talk to each other, which means there might be a lot of back and forth. So please be respectful and considerate and not off topic. And then know that I'm not necessarily going to be able to read all those chats while I'm also trying to talk. So the best way, if you want to get like a question in or a point that you want me to see while we're live here, the best way to do that is using the Q&A function, which will be at the bottom of your screen as a little icon. So let's jump in here. What I want to do tonight is talk about, I want to actually give kind of Move to Amend background, because there's a lot of people here who have been working with Move to Amend for a while, but I'm already seeing a bunch of names I don't know, and some folks who wrote in ahead of time saying that they were new. So that's part of the point here, is I want to talk about how important and how critical it is that we end corporate constitutional rights. And to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got involved in doing this work and what led me to, with a number of other people, form Move to Amend in 2009. But then I also want to talk about kind of where we are now and what has been, what some of Move to Amend's accomplishments have been over the last 10 years since we launched, and then also what some of our challenges are. And then I want to talk about kind of the current conditions, specifically pandemic and climate collapse, and kind of what the implications, discuss what some of the implications might be for us trying to do systemic work. So that's broadly where I want to go. And one of the things that Move to Amend has always been very clear about is that the problem did not begin with Citizens United. And these days, I think we also have to remind a lot of people that the problem did not begin, and it does not begin and end, with Donald Trump either. And so, in fact, it didn't begin and end with Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which is a Supreme Court case I will get to in a bit. It really starts going all the way back to the founding of the United States, and really before that, right, the colonization of the New World, which included what later became the United States, but obviously wasn't limited to just this continent. And but because we're here in the United States, that's kind of where I want to just take us back to and be really clear about. It is not an accident that we are in the situation that we are in right now. It is not an accident, as we're in terms of corporate constitutional rights, that corporations, which are property, have more rights than human beings in this country. It's true that there have been some particular Supreme Court cases along the way that have legally expanded corporations and the people who own corporations' ability to get around the law, unlike the rest of us. But the fact is that we ended up in a situation where property has more rights than people, because this country has always prioritized private property over human beings from the very beginning. That is what slavery was all about. That is what the colonization and genocide of Native Americans was all about. And so there's a founding violence and doctrine and ideology that our political system holds within it, and that our culture holds within it. And I think that we can look to just recently, and Breonna Taylor's, the ruling that came out in that case, that the damage to the wall and the threat to property on the part of the police officers who shot not her, but the apartment that she was in, is what actually the punishment came down for, instead of punishment for ending her life. It's just a perfect example of how we have never gotten rid of this issue. And it is, to me, the most fundamental piece of what we're going to need to uproot and then destroy in our thinking. And to me also, that is the root of the ideology that has brought us to the brink in terms of climate collapse as well. Believing that the earth and the animals that we share it with, and ourselves as animals too, are expendable in comparison to the accumulation of wealth and property and private property, and specifically, putting up walls so that people and animals don't have access to resources that we need for survival, whether that's water or land or what have you. So that's where I want to kind of start off, and that's also where I want to end. But I want to talk to you. I'm going to share some slides here to kind of tell the story of how Move to Amend started. From my perspective, there are many people who are involved with Move to Amend, and we kind of all came to this in our own way. But a number of us who started the group were originally, when we first formed, living in Humboldt County, California. So even though I'm from New Mexico originally, and that's where I am right now, Humboldt County and Northern California is where I have lived for most of my adult life. And I still consider that one of my homes for sure, even though I currently live in Sacramento officially. So I don't know if any of you have been to Humboldt. Feel free to say that in the chat. It's far Northern California. It's on the coast. It has a pretty large, relatively speaking, bay. It's incredibly rural. It's not what people would normally think of as California when you think of California, but it is on the ocean. It has 6 beautiful rivers that flow through the county. And it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. It's also home to the oldest living beings on our planet, redwood trees. So there's just a lot that's really special and important and unique about Humboldt County and that area. So the other thing, though, about Humboldt County is it's pretty divided, and in a lot of ways, mirroring a lot of the United States. And a lot of that division is over resource extraction. I would say at the core, that's what the division stems from. And so before I moved to Humboldt County, I moved there in 2001 after 3 years of college. And I moved there to work with an organization called Democracy Unlimited, which was one of the founding groups of Move to Amend. And before I moved there, Humboldt County underwent a massive and very rapid change as a result of a timber company. Pacific Lumber Corporation was kind of had been around for forever. People had worked for Pacific Lumber, for generations. So, there were people whose grandparents and great-grandparents and parents, et cetera, worked and were timber workers. And I will skip a very compelling and interesting story that you might want to look up about kind of how it came to be that Pacific Lumber Corporation was bought in a hostile takeover by a company called Maxam Corporation from Houston, Texas. And Maxam bought the company kind of unbeknownst to the people who owned it. They kind of naively put it on the public market or trading market with the idea that the workers over time would buy the majority of stocks and come to own the company. But that's not how capitalism works. You had this totally undervalued company, because the thing about Pacific Lumber is that even though they didn't have really like sustainably certified forestry at the time, this is in the 80s, they had an ethic as a company of trying to they definitely didn't clear cut, and they managed the forest that they owned in a way that would ensure that the company's longevity was part of the plan. And that was so that people could work there for their lifetimes, and then their children's lifetimes as well. So it's not like it was all perfect, but it wasn't what we think of today as a timber company in terms of most of our experience if we live in places where they are operating now. So Maxam Corporation bought Pacific Lumber in a hostile takeover, and then engaged in massive clear cutting, and also raided the pensions of the employees and sidled Pacific Lumber with all of the debt from Maxam had as a result of the other work that they did around the owner was involved with junk bond trading and other dubious stuff, did this to other companies as well. Kaiser Aluminum in Washington State also suffered a similar fate at the hands of Maxam. So in response, our community in Humboldt, and then also a number of other people from outside of Humboldt County came to protect the redwood trees, the old growth redwood trees. And there was a campaign launched, kind of calling people to come do that, made up of locals, but then also a number of young people who were, absolutely devastated to hear about what was happening to these trees that, were older than any human beings alive, came. So does anybody know who this woman is? This is from a minute ago, so you might not recognize her, but some of you might be a little bit more in the loop, and you can put in the chat if you do. Yeah, so Karen gets it first. So this is Julia Butterfly Kill. So I remember hearing about her when I was in high school. She actually sat in this tree from December. So the tree's name was Luna. They named her the tree, and Julia Butterfly was in the tree for 738 days from December 10th, 1997 to December 18th, 1999. So I graduated high school in 1998. So I remember hearing about her and being inspired by what the forest defenders were doing in Humboldt County and the protection of these trees. She was able to ultimately protect this tree, although the ecosystem was still devastated, I have to say, and what was protected was minuscule compared to what was taken. Also, at the same time, there was a retaliation on the part of law enforcement and also timber workers and Maxam Corporation against the forest defenders who were occupying trees in Humboldt and the area. So the pictures on the left are of activists who are actually locked down, so they're attached to each other, blocking a timber road to block logging trucks from going in, and the sheriffs swabbed pepper spray directly into their eyes. So I know we've seen a tremendous amount of police cruelty and brutality over these last few months right in front of our faces. And, I'm sure many of you know that that's not new. That's not unique to this time. It is obviously something that happens much more to Black folks and Black and brown folks, but it also happens to activists. And so in 1997, oops, I didn't mean to go forward yet. Sorry. This was an act performed by our district attorney, or sorry, by the sheriff. It was direct orders from the sheriff. And then also around the same time, the following year, David Chipsy Chain was an activist who was in a tree that was cut down intentionally, and he was murdered in all of it. He was crushed and he died. And so I show you these things and tell you these things to give you a sense of how divided the community was and how calling it timber wars was not hyperbole. There was violence. In fact, there was death as a result of this battle to try and protect Humboldt County's redwood trees. So I didn't live there yet, okay? But I moved in there after that, and I'm gonna actually keep it on that for one more second. And the context was a deeply divided community, and the reason why is because an outside corporation came in and tried to act as though they were, law enforcement acted on their behalf over the behalf of the public agenda and needs. There was no discussion about what was going to happen to these trees because it was all private and it was Maxam's authority and they could do whatever they wanted, and they did. So in response, the community organized itself. So first, it was sort of like activists and a lot of environmental work, lawsuits, things like that. And actually in terms of in that fight, on the whole, the community lost. Most of the old growth redwood trees were cut. Some of them were preserved, and and it wasn't all for absolutely nothing, but in terms of what the goal was, Maxam won. So we were able to elect a new district attorney. So the district attorney who was in office after, because these activists sued and lost, the district attorney wouldn't even actually, move the case forward to try and, in the argument that this was, cruel and inhumane and unlawful actions on the part of the sheriff and the deputies. So we elected a new district attorney, and he also, right after he took office, he sued Maxam Corporation for fraud because they would regularly lie on their timber harvest plans so that they could cut more. And then by the time the lawsuits would get through the system, they would already have done the cuts, and then they would just pay fines, and then they would just go, sorry. And the damage had been done, and it was irreversible. And so that was their routine practice. And so our new district attorney that we organized and we fought very hard to elect, to kind of change the whole demeanor of the top law enforcement person in our county, turned around, and within a couple of months of taking office, he sued Pacific Lumber and Maxam Corporation for fraud. That case was actually thrown out, and the argument was, interestingly, on something related to corporate personhood and corporate constitutional rights, because Maxam made the argument, well, when we petition the government, which is true for us, we are not obligated to tell the truth, because that would be kind of that would have a chilling effect if people felt as though they always had to tell the truth when they got up in front of, say, elected officials and they gave their 2 minutes in a public meeting. If we were held to telling the truth, then if we misspoke and we could get charged, so there has been case law that has established that we do, as part of our First Amendment, when we're speaking politically and petitioning our government, we're actually not necessarily obligated to tell the truth. However, submitting a timber harvest plan is not petitioning the government. That's like saying, when I submit my taxes, I'm petitioning the government. And under my First Amendment, I'm allowed to say whatever I want because it's my First Amendment right. That's obviously not something that people enjoy, but the courts of Humboldt County actually agreed, and so that case was thrown out. So just an example of how we don't actually need, corporations oftentimes don't need to take these cases all the way up to the Supreme Court in order to get their justice. The legal system follows in line for them all the way down to county courts. But we did get our district attorney. But the other thing that Pacific Lumber did in response, or I should say Maxam Corporation did in response, was initiated a recall campaign against our district attorney 3 months after he had taken office. And I will skip ahead and tell you that we were able to fight that off, but it was the most expensive campaign in the history of our community at that point. And this is a very small community. There's 80,000 voters total. It's not, it was not a place where elections cost a lot of money. And they poured almost $500,000 into this campaign to try and unseat our district attorney that we had just elected. And it was because he was trying to enforce the law against them. So we basically fought this huge fight to get a new district attorney, and then we had to turn around and put it all back together again and fight another fight. So the organization that I worked with, Democracy Unlimited, was involved in that effort. We weren't central to the anti-recall campaign. We were working at the local level to educate about corporate personhood and corporate constitutional rights, and why when corporations have rights, it makes our ability to exercise self-control, community control and local control impossible. So so even though we were able to win, it came at a humongous cost on the part of our community. It meant that there were other races that we couldn't invest in because we had to fight this other one twice. It meant that our community had to put $250,000 of our own dollars into a race to keep somebody in office that we had already just said that we wanted. And it also was, thousands and thousands and thousands of volunteer hours. And it was incredibly, it was empowering in a way to bring the community together, but it also felt like a total waste and a futile fight. And this company shouldn't have the power to force us to do this. And so Democracy Unlimited put together a campaign that we ran as a proactive ballot initiative that was Measure T. It was called the Humboldt County Ordinance for Fair Elections and Local Democracy. And what it said is that in Humboldt County, corporations don't have constitutional rights. And so therefore, we are banning any outside company from contributing money to our local elections. And it passed with 55% of the vote in June 2006. And we brought thousands of volunteers into the campaign. We ended up using these little tea bags. And we talked about how our founding fathers, fought against the East India Company and the, English Empire, and threw tea into the harbor. And we don't need to do that again. We should need to pass Measure T. Or we do need to do that again. So it passed with 55% of the vote in June 2006. And it was the law for about a year and a half until our community was sued by a company that didn't meet our definition of a local company. And so they were banned from contributing money to political elections. And they made the argument that it was a violation of their First Amendment rights and their 14th Amendment rights because we were discriminating against one kind of corporation against others. And it was thrown out in federal court. Our county agreed not to enforce it. And then our county had to pay the legal fees of the company that sued us. Now, we expected that would happen. We actually thought they were going to sue us like immediately. And so that was actually a smart move on their part, kind of to wait for a year and a half, because Democracy Unlimited moved on to other campaigns, our community moved on to other campaigns. And so it was kind of hard to put it all back together again. It would have been easier if we had had kind of all the momentum of the win. So that was a smart move on their part. It was an example of why working against corporate constitutional rights at the local level ultimately means that your community, unless we have enough communities that are doing it all over at the same time, you're going to be made an example of, and you're going to pay for it. And our hope had been, and the strategy that we were employing back in 2006 was, this can inspire other communities. And we went to other places, and there are a number of local communities that have passed not exactly the law like we did, but other measures against corporate constitutional rights, taking a local issue like we did and helping to the community to see that in order to exercise their sovereignty, corporations can't have constitutional rights, and so standing up against it. But unfortunately, most of those communities have been slapped down, or if they've been left to stand, what it has meant oftentimes is that the company that's causing harm just goes to a neighboring community that's less organized, maybe less resourced, and just sets up shop there. And that was part of why we came together in 2009 to form Move to Amend. So let's talk a bit about the Constitution and corporate constitutional rights, because there's probably some of you here who have heard of that, but maybe don't know all the ins and outs. So the US Constitution has two entities in it. It's really all about what the relationship is between those two entities. So we, the people, at least according to the Constitution, are the ones with all the power. And to the extent that government has any power, that's delegated power to use on our behalf. And so in this framework, the people are free and sovereign. we have individual rights that are spelled out in the Constitution. And then we are also seen as private. And then in contrast, government is subordinate and accountable to the people. Government has collective duties, and government is public. Now we're going to talk later about whether any of this has ever actually been how anything has operated, right? But I can't keep going, although I will in a minute, to talk about corporations without slamming on the brakes and pointing out that at the founding of this country, and then subsequently for all of the time since, the struggle has been for all of the people who were not recognized by those initial framers as human beings to make clear that we are people and that we deserve a place in this Constitution. So it was Howard Zinn and Molly Ivins kind of reiterated. Both of them talked about how, you know, the history of the United States can be told through the lens of the series of people's movements that had to be amassed in order to assert that they were people too. Because the portion of people who were recognized as human beings by those initial framers were only themselves and their friends, and it was about 5% of the population, of the adult population of people who lived on this continent were recognized as human beings. And I really think it's important, and I really hope that here we are in 2020 and able to not excuse that away and not say, well, you know, that was just the time. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That was a political fight at the founding of this country. It's been a political fight and question ever since. And different, you know, the opposing sides in terms of we the people, the real we the people, and the small elite minority have at different times, you know, we have made gains and they have made gains, but they made a huge gain when they instituted the Constitution on their own behalf solely. And it was a discussion. There was debate about whether there should be slavery, and they decided, yes, we're going to keep having slaves. And there was a debate and a discussion whether women were human beings, and they said, no, our wives and our sisters and our mothers are not full human beings. And there was a question of whether Native people would actually be treated as human beings or whether they would be treated as animals. And for the most part, the founders were very clear on that one. And even though some of them spoke with great respect in some of their writings about some of the Native folks like the Iroquois, and when it came to how the United States and the government of those men treated Native people, it was always cheating, it was always stealing, it was always lying. All right, so yes, there was important moment in this country that was about throwing off the idea of a monarchy, but we need to really disrupt the lie that we are told as Americans and that we proclaim to the rest of the world, but most importantly, that we believe here as Americans, that these were some sort of uber enlightened people who we need to follow direction from today. At a time where everything about our world is completely different than everything about their world. And thank God, a lot of that includes that people have fought and made clear that, yes, we the people means all human beings. And that's still a question, obviously, and a debate and a fight that's still continuing on. But I'm just, you know, like, if nothing else this year and kind of thinking about this presentation, one thing I just want to make clear, and if some of you get upset, then I'm sorry, but this like founding father worship and this idea that we need to be beholden to people who owned other human beings and justified that, even if they said lofty words, I'm over it. I'm done with it. We're not doing that anymore. It's just, it doesn't serve us at all. There's no point to it, and it holds us back in huge ways that are very intentional. And it's part of why this country remains stuck in so many ways around racism and around gender exploitation and around exploiting the environment. So let's move forward. Okay, we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I'm not here to worship George Washington, like ever. So let's talk about corporations though, because there was what the interesting thing about, even though a tiny fraction of the human beings anointed themselves as the real human beings, and the rest of us were left to fight that and force ourselves, drive ourselves into this constitution. The interesting thing was that because corporations were the tools that were used by the British Empire to actually rule here on this continent, there was a tremendous amount of distrust of corporations on the part of the men who wrote the Constitution. And so for that reason, corporations are not included in the Constitution. And the early corporations, there were corporations at the founding of this country. And the reason why is because, similar to the situation that the British monarch found himself in when Portugal and Spain and the Netherlands started their exploits to colonize this newfound world that Columbus tripped himself into, the King of England didn't have a lot of resources, unlike some of the other superpowers in Europe. And so he turned to his aristocracy and said, hey, let's get this going. Let's send, let's send ships, let's plant our flag. We need to get in on this. And the aristocracy responded, absolutely not, because of a doctrine that existed in the time called inherited debt. And inherited debt meant that exactly what it sounds like. If you died and you hadn't paid off your debts before you died, then your son would inherit those debts. And if he didn't pay them off, then his son. And of course, it was always sons, because women were property themselves, chattel property, so they couldn't have debt, they couldn't have property, they couldn't have land, they couldn't have legal rights. And so what the king did is said, well, the good news is I'm the sovereign, so I can just, good point. This inherited debt is a little bit of a, deterrent for you to like amass a fleet and put together your resources, because one ship lost at sea, pirates, disease. I mean, we all know what happened to Jamestown, right? It was a tremendously risky endeavor that the king was trying to get his cohorts to join with him on. Because of inherited debt. So he said, what we'll do is we'll create a new entity. It'll be called a crown corporation, and it's not going to have the debt. It's not going to have inherited debt. Everybody else will still have inherited debt. In fact, we're going to actually ship a bunch of people from here to this new place. We're going to ship felons, and a lot of those people who are in prison because they can't pay their debts, and when we're running out of space for what to do with them. And so, inherited debt stuck around, but not for these crown corporations. And so they had limited liability. So fast forward now to the slide that we're looking at here in the United States, after throwing off the king and East India Company and the corporations that were ruling each of the colonies. And they found themselves in a similar situation. The federal government didn't have the resources to do the project of building this new country by themselves. So they turned to private capital, but they maintained the same relationship that the king had, where at the end of the day, the sovereign, now we've replaced it with we the people, but only actually asterisk 5%, the uber special people, the white men with property who are Christians, they can start corporations and have property and all of those pieces. But they're all, these companies that they create are going to be accountable to the state governments that are the ones that create them. So that's why corporations are not in the Constitution, because the Constitution and the federal government was really just a theoretical idea on the part of this group of renegades who were fighting against the biggest colonial power in the world, and somehow were able to pull off a win, but there was no real meaningful oversight that they could actually institute through the federal government. So they made sure that corporations were chartered at the state level, and corporate charters had to be approved, and they were revocable by state legislatures and governors. Corporations existed for a limited amount of time. They had a defined purpose. They had to benefit the public. And if they didn't have a case for how they benefited the public, these corporations were not created. And they were prohibited from participating in the political process. And there were a whole number of other limitations that these early corporations had on them. The Pennsylvania Constitution and every other state had kind of similar language, made very clear and tells us very clearly how a corporation was treated at this time. The legislatures shall have the power to alter, revoke, or annul any charter of incorporation hereafter conferred by or under any special or general law, whenever in their opinion it may be injurious to the citizens of the Commonwealth. I don't know how many of you are from California, but imagine a Pacific Gas and Electric Company that has murdered people through negligence as a result of the fires numerous times was actually held to a standard like this that they had in Pennsylvania in 1857. And the list, goes on and on and on. What about fossil fuel corporations that knowingly duped us all into lies about how climate change wasn't real and wasn't going to be a problem for my entire lifetime? What should be what happens to these companies? Well, right now we don't have any leg to stand on because we have gotten rid of all of that for the most part. Corporate charters today are approved by legal clerks for a small fee. There's no, kind of public process involved in creating a corporation, let alone deciding if it's going to get to continue. They exist forever. That's the default, at least. And their purpose isn't defined or limited. In fact, the purpose is to maximize wealth and profit for shareholders. And this is actually a definition of what a corporation is that comes from case law, comes from a Michigan Supreme Court case in 1919. And it still is what maintains the standard for what a corporation can do and is and who they serve. And so that means that built into the DNA now, instead of this idea that a corporation exists to serve the public good and is a tool for bringing together capital when we might need to do a project that the public needs, now it is a tool to externalize costs onto the most marginalized people and vulnerable communities and maximize profit for a tiny minority. And there's no limit on political participation. So how did that happen? And I'm going to run through this pretty quick because I hope at this point many of you already know this, but I want to make sure that everybody does, because this is so, this is the fundamental education that Move to Amend has been doing to help people understand that this isn't about one bad court case. This isn't about one bad set of people who are the majority of the Supreme Court. It's not about one president. This is about the whole framework of our legal system. And there are ways that the wealthy elite have been able to further manipulate it. In fact, when we have been able to drive ourselves into the Constitution, oftentimes the swing is that they look at that and say, how can we use that? And the best example is the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War. So initially, the 13th Amendment was passed to end slavery, except for in the case of for people who are incarcerated or who are previously incarcerated. So that's a really big asterisk because that creates a huge incentive to make sure that the people that you want to make sure don't have equal protection end up somehow or other in jail. And then you can take away their equal protection rights and their ability to not be slaves. So the 13th Amendment was passed to end slavery, and the 14th Amendment was passed basically in preparation for what was expected to come from the southern states, and absolutely did, of what came to be called Jim Crow, of treating Black people, African Americans, well, we're talking about men here, right? Because women actually didn't have legal rights at the time. But men who had been enslaved were being discriminated against and being treated differently under the law. So the 14th Amendment was passed to make clear to the southern states, but everybody, that no person can be treated differently under the law. The law has to be applied equally to everyone. And then the 15th Amendment was passed to make clear that you cannot deny someone the ability to vote based on their skin color. So it was very clear what the purpose of it was. And Justice Miller, who was a Supreme Court justice, says succinctly, the main purpose of the last three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, was the freedom of the African race, the security and perpetuation of that freedom, and their protection from the oppression of the white men who had formerly held them in slavery, the founding fathers. So that was why we passed those three amendments in this country. But immediately, corporations started to make the argument that they were a person, and all of those ways that I described to you before, the corporations were treated with extra scrutiny and control because they are a tool for amassing capital, and they are also a tool that allows the owners to not have full liability for the actions of the corporation. They're separate. They're a business entity, which now is how almost all businesses are, but it didn't used to be that way. There were a special case where you would allow the owners to separate and have limited liability from the actions of the company itself. And so the trade-off was that you were more accountable to the public because you got this extra power. And so corporate lawyers started to make the argument that the 14th Amendment was that all of these laws and also it was written into state constitutions as well. All of that was a violation of the 14th Amendment because corporations were being discriminated against. But the court said in 1877, no, let's be clear here, the 14th Amendment does not apply to you. But only a little bit later, you had this case, which there's a whole interesting book, Tom Hartman's Unequal Protection, goes into the detail, which I am not going to, about Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, and how a court clerk is probably who inserted this in. This likely did not even happen in the case. But in the headnotes of the case, once it was written up, there's this piece where it was another example of corporate lawyers trying to argue that this tax law that treated corporations differently in Santa Clara, California from other types of business and regular people was violating their 14th Amendment right. And supposedly, according to the clerk and what he put in, the Chief Justice said, the court does not wish to hear argument on the question of whether the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids a state to deny any person within its jurisdiction equal protection of the laws, applies to corporations. We are all of the opinion that it does. So a head note is not legally binding. And so there are some people who get kind of excited about that, like, oh, it's a conspiracy, and it was probably, and therefore we just need to kind of like point this out to smarty pants people on the Supreme Court or something. But the reality is that there were subsequent cases that did rule explicitly, and there's no, we can't go back on a technicality, because the point was, this was the robber baron sort of crowning achievement. So you have all these human beings, African Americans, people who had been enslaved, who fought, and then others, abolitionists, white abolitionists, who joined in the fight for the liberation and were able to drive themselves into the Constitution. And you had the women's movement that was right there as both as part of that movement and also in addition to that movement, right behind it, saying, okay, the 14th Amendment is denying us, or I'm sorry, the 14th Amendment makes clear that these states that deny us the ability to vote because we are women is obviously a violation of the 14th Amendment and our equal protection. And so you had all of these people threatening this ruling elite that had maintained control through defining the rest of us as non-humans, this wave of movement. And then we also had a changing of the economic system. So we went from a slave system to an industrial capitalist system. And these industrial capitalists who ran the railroads and who were busy, arguing that the US government should go from sea to sea and give them all sorts of land and displace the people who live there and fight a war with Mexico to steal their resources. They had a huge amount of power and they had a huge amount of investment, and the tool that they wanted to use for their to continue to consolidate their economic power was the corporation. But ironically, their forefathers who had set them up to have the resources that they had didn't trust corporations, because that was a different era. And so they had to undo that, and they had to fight back against these people's movements. And so they took our amendment, which I think is the most important. I mean, I know we love the First Amendment in the United States, but I think the Equal Protection Amendment, saying everyone is equal, everyone's going to be treated under the law, I think there's no better amendment than that amendment that we currently have. And they took it away and they used it for themselves. And as a result, the overwhelming majority of cases heard before the court after the Civil War around the 14th Amendment were cases that expanded the ability for corporations to use the 14th Amendment, not African Americans. And so I won't read these, I'm sure you've been able to see. So this is why it's like, it's not about one case. So what it means in the 14th Amendment is that, we can't make clear in our communities what kinds of companies, what kinds of businesses are okay based on their behavior, because that is outside the bounds of our authority. Companies that want to come into our communities, no matter how they behave, no matter what they do, no matter how much they pay, no matter how much they pollute, we have to make room for them, because otherwise we're discriminating against corporations. Or if they want to build cell towers that are known to cause, sickness, doesn't matter. We don't have that authority. So I already kind of said all of this. I'll go ahead and, skip through this, except for the piece about, I want to underscore how women, like I said, tried to use the 14th Amendment in a case, Minor v. Hepperset, where women went into the polls and they voted and they were arrested. And they said, you didn't have a right to arrest us, because the 14th Amendment should make these laws that states all have that deny us the ability to vote. Those are all unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court in 1874 said really explicitly, 14th Amendment doesn't apply to you. The 14th Amendment is only for African Americans. But then in Plessy v. Ferguson, they took it away from African Americans. And the whole point of the 14th Amendment was to make Jim Crow not happen. But the Supreme Court said, well, as long as the accommodations are equal, if they're separate. And they were never equal, and everyone knew they weren't equal. The whole point of them was to not be equal. The point of them was to cause an apartheid situation for Black people in the South, and the Supreme Court facilitated that, taking the 14th Amendment away from the people who we passed it for. And then they went on from there to secure the Fourth Amendment. So corporations can claim immunity against searches and seizures of their books, records, and other property. It used to be that all of that was available, if not to the public, and in many states it was just the public, but at least to our elected officials on our behalf. One of the dissenters in the minority on that case said, in my opinion, a corporation, an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of law, cannot claim the immunity given by the Fourth Amendment, for it is not a part of the people within the meaning of that amendment. But he was in the minority. And then we have further expanding that with additional cases that came afterwards. So what that means is we don't know what corporations are putting in their products oftentimes, because they're able to hide and say, well, this is our private property. These are trade secrets. And so, if they are acting in a way that is irresponsible in terms of, BP and the way that they're, the safety measures that they have in place, inadequate. And so we have, as a result, a huge disaster where people die and the entire Gulf is polluted. Well, That's just the way that things are and the cost of doing business. And at the root of that thought is this idea that corporations are private instead of public, responsible to us because we're the ones who brought them into existence in the first place. Corporations, there's nothing natural about a corporation. They are a creature of the law, and so therefore we should hold them accountable, and knowing that they are amassing, concentrating wealth and resources, and we're giving them a leg up in being able to do that, means that that comes with a responsibility, but that's out the window if they have a right to privacy. They've also been able to claim a Fifth Amendment right. And so in cases where they have been able to argue that the Fifth Amendment, which says the government cannot take your property without compensating you for it, companies going all the way back to the 1920s have been able to twist that logic to say that when communities pass environmental regulations, that's a takings of their property. What's the property? Their right to future profit. And so what is the remedy? They must be paid for the profits that they would have made if those laws hadn't been passed. What that means is that communities are then unable, because they cannot financially afford to protect themselves. So what we see here is in Pennsylvania, where coal companies were digging underneath towns and people's homes and collapsing people's homes and entire towns in on themselves. And so Pennsylvania passed a law to prohibit that, to curb the greed of digging even when structures are over them for all of the coal that they could possibly find. And the coal industry sued Pennsylvania and said, okay, sure, but you have to pay us for the money that we would have made if you hadn't passed that law. And what that means now is that local governments don't even pass the laws because their attorneys advise them that that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. And what that means is they will have to pay because of the precedent. And so, when that's so often why, local activists will be banging their heads against the wall trying to argue with their local elected officials, but their local elected officials oftentimes, even if they would like to protect their community, their hands are tied legally. So that's that case. Another dissenting opinion: restriction imposed to protect the public health, safety, or morals from dangers threatened is not a taking. The property so restricted remains in the possession of its owner. The state merely prevents the owner from making a use which interferes with paramount rights of the public. But again, because private property is more important to our justice system than human rights or than collective common rights, that doesn't matter. This is of course logical, but that's not what the majority of the court would find. So this isn't about the Roberts Court. This isn't about whatever nightmare of a court we're going to have next, because this goes way back, and this is how it has been, since for generations. It's baked into the American legal system. So the First Amendment was a huge coup on the part of the corporate elite when they were able to secure it, going back to the 1970s. So first, the court ruled that political spending is considered protected speech, meaning that spending money in elections is protected by the First Amendment. What that means, in effect, we all know the effect that has, right? It means that if you have more money, then you have more of a right to influence the political system. And that is exactly how it is. And that was before Citizens United. And so, and then subsequently, they made clear that, yes, that applies to both rich people and corporations. So corporate spending for influencing or affecting voters' opinions is protected speech. It used to be that in states banned corporations from contributing money both to political elections, but also to ballot initiatives. And in the Bellotti decision, the court said that's unconstitutional. States don't have that authority. And then in 1996, they expanded it outside, went beyond the idea of money in politics to corporations have negative speech rights. They have a right not to speak. So Vermont passes a law requiring labeling, not even banning the ingredient, but requiring labeling of bovine growth hormone. And the dairy industry sues Vermont and says, we have a right not to speak under the First Amendment. You can't force us to speak. And this precedent has been used in numerous cases where states have tried to pass laws requiring disclosure of what's in products that people are buying. The latest one being Monsanto's Roundup. And Monsanto is making the argument that California doesn't have authority to require them to say that Roundup causes cancer. They're both saying Roundup doesn't cause cancer, but if it does, we're not required to say that it does. You didn't have authority to pass a law that tells every single company that puts cancer-causing products in ingredients in their products because of our right not to speak. What about our right to know? What about our right to hear? What about the property owners' rights not to have their homes collapse? You know, every step of the way, regular people's rights are trumped by the rights of giant corporations. And then Citizens United, we probably all know about that, overturned McCain-Feingold, basically saying that independent expenditures, political action committees, corporations, and the wealthy, you can't limit how much money can be raised in political action committees and their ability to influence elections. And then we have two other cases that expanded even further. The McCutcheon versus FEC is not a corporate related case. This is about the extreme wealthy. So they limited, or they got rid of the aggregate limits that individuals used to have on them for making donations to political campaigns. They also said that the government's only interest in corruption is literally quid pro quo corruption. So like if I show up with a money bag and I say, I'll give you this if you pass this law, that's illegal. But if I set up a super PAC and I send, as a company, and I send a lobbyist to elected official XYZ and I say, you know, we have this law that we'd like to see passed or not passed, and I have a political action committee with $10 million that's just looking for where we're going to spend it in the next election. What are you going to do? That's not corruption. And then the Hobby Lobby decision expanded the rights of the First Amendment rights to include freedom of religion to closely held for-profit corporations. So saying that basically the company will have the same, the owners can make the argument that a company has the same religious beliefs as the owners, even though there might be numerous people employed by that company that hold different religious beliefs. That doesn't matter. So the impact is that everything we hear, everything that's, you know, that happens in political campaigns is a result of who has the most money. And we don't even know at this point, because of the, you know, the dirty money, the hidden money, the black money, the dark money, that's what it's called, where it's coming from. And we don't have a right to know that. And so our political system, which never was really working all that well on behalf of regular people in my lifetime, but at this point, you know, there's no contest. So the results of these Supreme Court decisions, time after time again, is that corporate interests are weighed as the priority over the general welfare. And the pattern is that large corporations can afford to assert their rights better than small companies or regular people. And this allows them to minimize regulation or avoid it entirely. It means that wealth and power are used to slow or halt enforcement of the law. And then also any law that we enact in court or can be challenged in court. So, you know, California just passed a law yesterday banning 24 of the most toxic chemicals in that are put in beauty products and personal care products, so stuff that we're putting on our bodies, stuff that we're putting on children's bodies. And we'll see whether the beauty industry is willing to abide by that law, or whether they come up with some argument that it violates their rights in some way. Oh, and another law was passed requiring transparency around fragrance, which is in so many products and is considered right now a trade secret, so it's hidden. And there are literally thousands of chemicals that could be included under fragrance that are toxic. And California passed a law requiring the disclosure of those ingredients now, and we'll see whether the industry allows that to stand or whether they decide that that's a violation of their First Amendment right not to speak, for example. So it means that democracy is off the table. It's unavailable to us. So in response, we formed Move to Amend, and our amendment, the We the People amendment, says that the rights protected by the constitutions are the Constitution, singular, are the rights of natural persons only. Artificial entities like corporations, limited liability companies, and other entities shall have no rights under this constitution and are subject to regulation by the people. Number 2, federal, state, and local government shall regulate, limit, or prohibit contributions and expenditures, and the judiciary shall not construe the spending of money to influence elections to be speech under the First Amendment, and makes clear that the intent that this can't be used to abridge freedom of the press. So we've been working on this for 10 years, and we've made a tremendous amount of progress. We started as a group of people in 12 people in a living room in someone's house in advance of the Citizens United decision. Many of the groups that responded to Citizens United are million-dollar organizations, with dozens and dozens of staff. And some of them do good work. Some of them honestly do kind of shady work. But the reality is that we are regular people. We didn't have our amendment written when we first formed Move to Amend. We had literally a page. It wasn't even a website. It was a web page. And we had a lot of information that we had on it because, we had been working at the local level and understood this issue in our own communities, in our own life experience. And, we are smart people. I think we wrote a damn good amendment. This amendment we wrote a couple years after we formed, and it has stood the test of the last 8 years. It has been introduced in Congress, in the House, 4 times. At this point, we have 74 co-sponsors. And I can't tell you how, when we first started, the idea that we would be, have gotten to not just have our amendment introduced in Congress, the first Congress that it was introduced, it had 3 co-sponsors. And we thought that was entirely possible, that was like as far as we might be able to get, that we were just trying to push a concept, that we were leaning on all of the DC-based nonprofit industrial complex kind of political party entrenched organizations that had also joined this conversation, who did recognize that Citizens United was a problem, but they didn't want to get to the systemic root of the issue. They just wanted to put a Band-Aid on it, and because that would be easier, not because they don't understand what we're saying about the deeply problematic and undemocratic way that corporations and the judicial system have allowed our Constitution to be off limits to us when it comes to compared to corporations. They get that, but the paradigm of our country's capital and the people who do the work there is not about demanding what we actually need and fighting for the long term on issues because they have to happen, even if they're going to take a while. Unfortunately, the paradigm is, how do we tell our donors that we're succeeding? How do we negotiate with the current people in Congress, and what are we going to get out of them? And we have been at loggerheads because of that difference of framework. And so it's a huge feat that we have been able to convince 74 representatives who got there because some level of establishment support is had for them back in their community to take the risk and to support us. But unfortunately, as we're in this period that we're in now, I want to remind us about a study that was done in Princeton, from Princeton in 2014. So this goes back a ways, that basically looked at the fact that we as the public have almost no effect on what happens in Congress. They don't pay attention to us at all. And I think that for me, seeing what happened with the coronavirus relief, and the fact that our leaders in Washington at all levels just left us abandoned in the face of the pandemic. The fact that, the Republican Party is just outright cruel about it, right? And just used it as an opportunity to raid the public treasury, in effect, and stuff the pockets of billionaires. But the reality is that the Democratic Party didn't do much. They all voted for the first package, which is what did that. And now we have communities decimated, local businesses unable to restart, and basically like a nationwide fire sale happening on small business on the part of giant companies. And then when the Democratic Party was given the opportunity to at least put forward the demands, knowing that the Senate was likely to, do exactly what they did and not pass what the Democrats in the House put forward. But the, this is our, Nancy Pelosi said something like, this is our wish list. This is our best, case that we want to make. And it doesn't include healthcare for everyone. It doesn't include any kind of financial support in any real meaningful way. That's not means tested. It's just, I'm not going to go through all the details, but I think seeing how in an unprecedented situation, the Progressive Caucus couldn't even organize itself effectively to demand Medicare for all, for example, and elevate the conversation about what it would mean if, as literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are losing their insurance because they're losing their jobs, and that's the perfect time to make the argument for why we need healthcare for everyone. And at least during the duration of the pandemic, I'm not saying they necessarily could have gotten it, but like everyone is so unwilling to even talk about what we would need that I think we really need to grapple with, like, how realistic is it going to be that we're able to move an amendment forward like this in this context. And that doesn't mean that I think we should give up at all. But I think that we as an organization, we as a movement, need to talk about how we're going to address the fact that we can't get anywhere with these people, and that we need to actually, that doesn't mean give up and go home at all, far from it. What I mean is that we need to pull back, regroup, and figure out how to come forward with an even more revolutionary agenda. Because what I have just shared with you today, this is moved to a men's perspective in terms of the problem. It's not, corporate constitutional rights isn't going to, if we address that, that's not going to solve democracy. That's not going to solve the climate collapse. It's going to allow us to have our legal system not working against us. But if our political system is already 100%, for the most part, bought and paid for, and maybe there's a few exceptions there, but they can't get anywhere. And in fact, they're so sort of marginalized and demoralized that they're even marginalizing and demoralizing themselves. What are we going to do about that? I'm not interested in going home. I'm not interested in being done, but I'm also not interested in calling up congressional offices and asking them to move this amendment forward when what we need is so much bigger than that. What we need is a new constitution. And we can take some pieces of the Constitution that we have now, of course, there's good things about it, but the good things about it are all the amendments. Those are all the things that our forefathers and mothers fought for and put in there and had to negotiate with people who didn't even think that they were human beings, and that's what they were able to get. And when the pandemic first started, we heard a lot of people talking about how we have to make sure that things don't go back to normal. We have to use this opportunity, even though it's horrifying and it's obviously only going to, who knows where we're going to go. I'm not saying the pandemic is in any way good, but it's potentially an opportunity to get to jolt everyone. And now that we have been through multiple months of it, I'm not saying that I don't feel exhausted, but we have to figure this out, because besides the coronavirus, right behind that is climate change, and it's not even really right behind it, right? I mean, all of you in California, all of you in Florida, you know what I'm talking about. So I was thinking today about something that Arundhati Roy has said about the pandemic. So I'm going to just read you this quick quote. She has said, "In this time, as the coronavirus pandemic burns through us, our world is passing through a portal. We have journeyed to a place from which it looks unlikely that we can return, at least not without some kind of serious rupture with the past, social, political, economic, and ideological." And I also saw a point, I don't even remember what it came from. Somebody was talking about something else, but saying, "It's nearly impossible to expand us into the unknown if you are responding to or asking permission from the known." And I think that as Americans, I don't think that it's just Americans, but maybe Europeans have this problem too. But and maybe that's where we got it from. But this idea of like what we've been doing before needs to be, exalted and not actually critically looked at in terms of what the impact has been. We have a huge responsibility in the United States, I think, to get real about what this country is, what this country has been, what this country continues to be. And it's not because of Trump is the president, right? I mean, Trump is the sort of like president that maybe we've deserved after all this time, and is showing us some things about ourselves that have been here that we haven't dealt with. And we're totally on the defensive right now, I think, as, the left, I'm just going to say, because that's what Move to Amend has been part of, and we're not sorry about that. I think that the principles that we're putting forward can appeal to people who are more than on the left, but that's our political basis that we're coming from, and rather than trying to pretend like we're something that we're not, well, we're going to own who we are and be honest about it, and then engage with people who have different worldviews and philosophies, and figure out how to, whether we can build together. So on the left, we're just totally in this defensive place around what we're going to do about this election. And I don't have a good solution for it. And I don't really want to take us there into talking about like how to vote, because that's not the point. I mean, I think the debate showed us that no matter what happens, we're going to be with someone in charge who doesn't have an agenda of what needs to be done. And in a lot of ways, leftist leaders are not willing to be honest about how bad it is, and how much needs to be done, and how deep we need to uproot. And so that's what we have to deal with. And I know there's been a lot of comments in the chat, and I haven't been able to see them all, and I'm not really going to be able to go through all of them. I just want to tell you real quick about some of the things that Move to Amend folks have been working on since the pandemic. Some of these things are on the side as individuals, and some of these things are as move to amend. And to give you a sense of kind of where we're putting our energy, and I know that a number of you probably are doing similar things too, but this is kind of what I think that we need, some of what we need to focus on. So I think that we're going to need to take care of each other. I think that we are seeing that our political system, our economic system doesn't serve regular people, and in fact is all about exploiting us more and more and more. And that's just going to continue. Oops, wait, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to stop sharing my screen. And so, how do I do this? Okay, so we need to figure out ways to take care of each other outside of, and not expect that our government's going to do it, because they've proven that they don't care. So for example, my colleague Jessica has kind of been the main one who's been working on mutual aid in Las Vegas, but I know that Tara has done some in Sacramento, and some of our other folks are as well. So, you know, building networks of support for each other, to make sure that we have our basic needs met. Food and shelter are the main ones, but increasingly probably that's also going to need to be healthcare too. So I think we need to build that infrastructure up and continue to do that, and look to where we can do that in our communities. And we're going to have to recognize that that's going to need to happen as our communities shift and change, and potentially are displaced when we're talking about climate disasters, which are going to continue to happen. We also have to fight for our communities against corrupt local politicians and white supremacist police. So that's something that our Sacramento folks, in particular, my colleague and friend Keon, have been working on in Sacramento, where you know, the majority of our staff are located. And we're going to have to build up our communities to so that this protection that we need to do for each other as much as possible is not just happening on the margins, but we drive it into the to making sure that our local government is doing it. And our local government is incredibly under-resourced, and for the most part, it is run by people who don't have any sense of how to go about doing this, or in many cases, the will. But it is the place where we have the most ability to leverage power that we build. And so even though I've spent the last 10 years working at the national level with Move to Amend, and I'm not sure that I'm gonna be in a position to work at the local level myself, since I'm kind of having to move around because of my family, I think that that's something that we all need to look at doing and kind of taking on, and figuring out how to, frankly, do some of what we were trying to do at Democracy Unlimited before, which is build examples of communities that are in resistance to the federal, and sometimes state apparatus, and doing, you know, setting an example of how we can get our needs met in a way that isn't corporate capitalism. And then I also think it's really important that we build a new independent party that's not ruled by corporations. I personally, you know, have never been a member of the main two parties, and so that's a little bit easier for me to come to. But I just don't know how you could objectively look at this strategy of trying to push either party, but probably most of us who are on this call have spent more energy trying to push the Democrats than probably the Republicans. There may be some exceptions, but what do we have to show for it? In my lifetime, we have nothing to show for that. We do have a few people in Congress, but the reality is those people they either get co-opted or they are marginalized. And the amount of resources that we have spent on political races with almost nothing to show for it when we're done is mind-boggling to me. Move to Amend has struggled financially since 2016. And the main reason is because people have, the pool of people, I mean, the people who fund Move to Amend are not wealthy people. We have a couple folks who, have a bit more money, but for the most part, it's all of us, giving what we can. And, maybe if we can give a few $100s, that's a huge, significant investment. And we only have so much of that to go around. And when we're contributing that money to presidential candidates, literally throwing it away, if we look back on what happened this time and last time, and then now all of these Congress members, and we don't have anything to show for it. We need to get more serious about looking at the strategies we're employing and saying, is this working? Are we making progress? Nothing's going to be a quick fix. It's not going to happen easily, but it is important that we assess along the way and we make sure that we're having success, that we're building more power. And especially when our candidates at the top then potentially veer and sell us out, we have to make sure that the leaders that we're willing to follow are actually committed to seeing it through. So I really, the money piece really hits home because, Move to Amend has almost had to fold a couple times. And I'm not here to, I don't mean that we should keep Move to Amend going because Move to Amend has been going. I think that is a mindset that lots of times organizations get into that is really problematic. Sometimes an organization, needs to shift and become something else. And that's actually something that I think that we're willing to, look at. But our project has not been fulfilled. Corporations still have, as much, if not more, power than ever. And it's not because of our lack of trying. It's because people have moved on to prioritizing other things. And maybe that's strategic and makes sense. But then when you look at what we've prioritized, do we have anything to show for it? That's the question. And it's not to say that the Sanders campaign wasn't able to, bring a lot of people together, and there's potentially some power that can be built from that. I'm not saying that it's absolutely hopeless, but in terms of the millions of dollars that we all spent, do we have a lot to show for it? And I think that we should be a little bit more discerning, because that's what it comes down to, is this is up to us. So we've got the resources we've got the brains that we've got the time that we've got, and there's nobody who's going to swoop in and save us. There's nobody who has this figured out. There's nobody who's in Congress who has these solutions, who knows what to do. Look at how they're behaving and what they're doing. Even the ones who we would consider leaders have no plan. So that means that we've got to come up with a plan. And that means that the resources that we have are what we have to try and implement that plan. And we should make sure that we're maximizing them. And so therefore that takes me to the last piece. And then happy to talk about, whatever you guys want to talk about in the time that we have left, which is about half an hour. I know this has been me talking for a long time. I hope that we can kind of continue this conversation and have more voices than just me, but we had a different vision of what this was going to be initially. And so I was going to do it. And then as I sat down to put this presentation together, I was like, I can't just do the regular Move to Amend presentation. I want to talk to you about where we are now. And that's not where we were, a year ago. And so what we were saying a year ago, I don't think is as relevant as what I'm trying to talk about now. So I would love to, kind of have a panel talking about this, or a discussion. And it's hard to do that stuff with Zoom in a way that's really participatory, but we're going to try. And the focus that we're going to work under is towards a people's constitution, because yes, we need the We the People Amendment, and we're going to continue to work on the We the People Amendment and figure out how to do that in an effective, meaningful way in today's times. And we invite you to help us figure that out. Move to Amend, has never been a group that's been like, let's just keep on doing what we've been doing and hope that someday it starts working. All of this stuff that I'm saying about needing to be strategic and reassess and make sure that we're going in the right direction and make sure that we're as effective as possible is all something that is like an ethic of our organization. And so when I tell you that I'm not sure that what we have been doing is what we should continue to do, that means that that's an invitation for us to figure it out together, just like it has been every step of the way. But we do think that a piece of it is that we need to be demanding more. We need to demand more, and we need to help people see that the system is not broken, it is fixed, and that this isn't a new problem. This is endemic of the whole thing that is the United States of America and always has been. And so that's what we need to talk about and help people see. And the reality is that evidence of that is like everywhere you friggin' look right now, right? Like the collapsing and the fact that the system doesn't serve people is everywhere. It's, and I don't need to go through the examples for you. And so let's use that opportunity. Let's use that opportunity to push. Let's use that opportunity to try to figure out a way to get out of this defensive posture and into an offensive posture. And so one piece of that, we think, in keeping with all the work that we've done over the last 10 years, one responsibility that we feel like Move to Amend has to this is to look at the Constitution as a whole and how it was written, who it was written by, what the intentions were, and along the way, how we've only been able to ever add into it instead of like reassess it, and what would it look like if we had a people's constitution. And I'm not saying that we want to rewrite the Constitution in this political climate. That is not what we are wanting to do. But the only way that we would figure out how to move towards that would be to first figure out, well, what is it? What is that vision? What is that vision, and can we articulate it in a compelling way that will bring people to that agenda? Because we think that that is a piece of what needs to happen. Going forward. We think that that's a responsibility that the United States has to figure our shit out so that we can stop playing it out on the entire rest of the world, right? So we need some stuff in our Constitution about like not being imperialists, for example. But since our Constitution was written by imperialists, we're not going to get it from what we've already got. We've got to rethink it. So we're having a People's Movement Assembly, which is a process that we have borrowed from wise people in the global South and in the US South and grassroots movements all over the world. It's a participatory process to solve a problem, and we would like to solve the problem of how do we articulate what a people's constitution would be and what it would look like. So this is a visioning day. This is not a strategy so much time, although that will come. So the People's Movement Assembly, or the PMA, you can find out about that if you go to movetoamend.org/PMA. It's on October 24th and 25th. There's a lot of information on the page where you can RSVP about it. And I will put the link in the chat here as well, that you can use to go to it. I know a lot of you, hundreds of, or almost 200 of you are already signed up, which is great. But tell your friends, let's have a really big group of people as we begin this conversation. And this is not actually, we begin this conversation in this context, because this is not actually the first time we've had this conversation. We have had numerous People's Movement Assemblies about a new constitution over the years. And we have done those in person though. And we have built up a lot of thinking about it, and we want to share some of that with you to kind of bring folks up to speed who haven't been able to be part of those conversations. And then also, obviously, as I've said several times, the context is different now, and so what does that mean? And I know, like, we are in the process right now of getting pushback from folks about this. We're not going to abandon the We the People Amendment. We want to figure out how to make our movement more effective, more powerful, and take advantage of the moment. And even though it feels like this is maybe a moment that isn't hopeful and that doesn't make sense to, like, how do we possibly get on the offense given what we're up against? But I believe that that is the only way that we're going to be able to kind of like see clear and make sure that we go in the direction that we need to go. I think we can do that. I think that part of the problem is that we think small and timid and scared instead of brave and bold and entitled, but not in a bad way, right? Entitled collectively. And that we've got to push ourselves to claim that power. That's the only way that movements and people have been able to do the impossible before. I mean, imagine the people who said, we're going to end slavery, even though that's the economic system, even though that's the police state, even though we're incredibly marginal, even though we are enslaved ourselves, or if we harbor people who, and help free people, we could get killed, and people did it anyways. And so that's the kind of courage and vision that we have to get in touch with. And that's not thinking small and who's going to be the next president, or who am I going to elect to my congressional seat? It's just not that. We need to be bigger and braver than that. It kind of freaks me out that there's so many comments that I can't see and respond to. So I think I'm going to let it go at that with the invitation to the People's Movement Assembly, because I do want to see if there's some questions. I think that some of the questions that people asked me were so from a long time ago that they might not make sense to talk about them, but let me skim through here. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A is the better place. But if you want everybody to see what you want to say, then you can put it in the chat. Okay, so somebody asked, or Kevin in Washington asked, what are your thoughts about a constitutional amendment establishing a new constitutional convention? I think that's where we need to build to. I think there's a lot of movement building that we need to do and power building that we would need to do before we could have a constitutional convention that wouldn't be set us backwards. And I don't think a constitutional amendment is how we would do it, right? I think we actually, part of what I'm saying is there's two ways to amend the Constitution. There's through Congress, or there's the states having a convention. And the people who are the most organized towards having the states have a convention are extreme right-wing people who do not want to have any kind of convention that I want to be part of. And I would not want to help facilitate them having that convention, right? And then the problem with Congress is that they're just like thoroughly entrenched with the status quo in so many ways, even the ones who are on our side. So I think what we need to do is build up the demand for systemic and huge, massive change. And then we have to build the relationships in our communities that would make it possible for us to do that. So I think we would be more interested in having a constitutional convention more like through a people's participatory process. And even if we're not able to actually be legitimately doing it on the first several rounds, still the process and the act of doing it and helping get ourselves into a state where we think that we actually should have a say over what the Constitution says, which is not something that most people think, is kind of like step one. And that's part of why we want to start to have those steps, because there's no way that that vision can happen unless we actually start to do the work. And I don't know all the steps to get us there at all, and nobody at Move to Amend does, but we are interested in starting to try. And I do think that that can happen in conjunction with the other stuff that needs to happen. So if we're building mutual aid networks to take care of each other, those are places where people trust each other and they are already working together. So how do we tap into those networks to also be talking about, you know, building political power together? Or the fact that we need to build a new independent party. How do we make sure that that political party understands that we have a vision for more from our Constitution than we currently have, you know, and grow leaders who are articulating what that vision is, and that comes from these participatory processes at the local level, for example. Okay, let's see. A lot of these questions are like about like particular things that I said in one moment. So I'm sorry. Next time, maybe we can have a way for somebody to be like watching and then interrupting whoever's speaking so that we don't go too far. George says, why not publicly financed elections? Doesn't seem to be any discussion on this idea. Yeah, I mean, move to amend, we actually talked about and thought about when we first wrote our amendment, should it include publicly funded elections in it? There's a lot of like details around publicly funded elections. And so at the time, we felt as though that was more a policy and legislation that would articulate how that would work. And also that, you know, some communities might do that differently than others. And there were lots of ideas for kind of how to do publicly funded elections that don't make sense to be specifically in the Constitution. And so we left it out. But in principle, in terms of our elections, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that we wouldn't be able to implement that without an amendment like ours. And so we saw that as sort of like the thing that would come right after as it related to campaign finance. The reality is that Move to Amend is not a campaign finance organization. We're a democracy organization. And that's why I'm giving the presentation that I gave, which is, you know, in some ways new, but a lot of it wasn't, because that's where we see the problem coming from, is that, you know, we're trying to challenge corporate constitutional rights because that's this fundamental idea that property has more rights than people. And that's much more fundamental than money in elections from our perspective. But we support the policy of publicly funded elections and have worked with the groups that are doing that. And certainly I think that that should be part of a new constitution. Somebody asked if the recording would be available. Yeah, so this is being broadcast on YouTube now, and so it'll be on our YouTube channel, and we'll send it out to everybody as well. Okay, that's a lot of info about toxins. Are you going to talk about the 24th and 25th? Yes, that was before I did, so. Okay, let's see. If we were to launch a rewrite of the Constitution, how would we block the big corporations from taking over the process and making it bend even more their way? Yeah, that's a good question. We have to figure that out. I don't have the answer to that, but it is a good question. I mean, it's the same question of like, if we were to pass the We the People Amendment, how do we make sure that they don't co-opt that and use it against us? Like, who would have thought that when you say no state can deny any person equal protection under the law, that we would end up here, right? So a lot of that is not really a question about what the words say, it's about the political power that we've built. And the reality is that even though it's, I mean, at the end of the day, there are more of us than there are of people who own these giant corporations who have an interest in sucking up all of the resources. There are more of us than there are Jeff Bezos, et ceteras. And it's almost like too simplistic that that's like the end all be all answer, but I really do think that at the end of the day, that's like the end all be all answer, is that what we have now is that people don't believe that they have power, and they don't know how to work together, and they don't believe that we can work together, and they don't think that we can win. And I don't know if we can win, but I do know that we need to do this fight. And so we have to help people get in touch with their power. And in my experience, the best way to do that is to organize collectively, locally, where you can be face to face. And it's a weird, crazy thing that face to face now is like different, and who knows when that will change. But look at how we've been able to figure out, how to stay in touch with each other so far, and we need to continue to build on that. And so, yes, they will fight us. I think that's what you're asking, Karen, is like, how do we make sure they don't fight us? We can't. They will, right? So we have to organize, and we have to. I mean, at the end of the day, I really do think that the biggest hurdle is that people just don't feel empowered, and they're not in touch with their power. And so that's what we have to figure out how to do. And that's why I think some of these solutions that maybe are smaller, but not really, like what's more fundamental than making sure that you have a place to live and food to eat. And so doing that together, and fighting those fights and taking care of each other, and rebuilding our communities, or building new communities when we have to be displaced because of climate fires or what have you. I mean, like, those are the things that help us see that we actually, we have the numbers, which at the end of the day is actually what matters. Okay. Well, I'm glad that Barbara is thrilled by my candor tonight. I was a little scared, not of Barbara, but in general. So Barbara's running for House legislature in Florida, and was hoping you'd address the issue of how to move to how to move the state legislature towards we the people. So that might be another piece of this, right? One that we haven't really been able to employ at Move to Amend yet, but we've talked about, is that maybe some of these visions that we have for what should be in the ultimate constitution, like corporations are not people and only human beings have rights, maybe those things need to be implemented at the local or at the state level first in certain states, and in direct opposition to the Supreme Court as part of standing up. And then the other piece is that state legislatures are huge. If we're actually going to use the convention process, and if the Constitution can like withstand this next election and what happens with that, and if we even have it, then the states actually have a tremendous amount of authority. They have the ability to bypass Congress to change the Constitution, whether that's with one amendment or more. And so I think, and a lot of state legislatures are very difficult to get elected to, and not that much better than Congress, but every stage that's closer to the people is a place where we have more capacity. And if we weren't spending millions of dollars on presidential races, maybe targeted, to take over some particular states and set some examples. I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, so at the People's Movement Assembly, first it's about visioning what we would want, and then comes like, well, how do we get there? And so those are the kinds of things where like, I'm not going to call those shots at all because I don't know, but that's what we need to figure out together. Okay, let's see. All right, so I see that there's some other questions, but I also want to just kind of take a look at the chat here and see. So how many of you are going to join us at the People's Movement Assembly? Will you say in the chat if you're going to on the 24th and 25th? Just want to be clear that our request to you is that you only come if you are interested in engaging this conversation of what would a people's constitution look like, and how would we begin to go there. And if you aren't down with that, if you feel like, hey, constitution we got is good enough for me, like, we'll let you know what happens. Don't worry, you can still be part of Move to Amend, but don't come and ruin our event with an argument about how we shouldn't be having this conversation, because we're having the conversation. So if that works for you, then you are 100% invited. And I love seeing all these people saying that you're coming. And if you're not totally sure, then you can still RSVP and you'll continue to get the details, and this is absolutely not going to be the only place where that conversation is going to happen. I also want to invite everybody to an event that we're having on the 6th, which I will have the privilege of speaking again, but not just me. It will be a number of other awesome folks who are kind enough to be joining us for a kind of panel conversation that is being hosted by our Interfaith Caucus. And the topic is the immorality of the climate crisis and corporate rule. So that's on October 6th, so that's Tuesday. And I will put the link to that in the chat as well. And you all are invited to that too. That's, you know, a place where there's going to be kind of more analysis. The People's Movement Assembly is more action oriented. But if you want to join that conversation, it would be great to have you join us on the 6th as well. Okay, well, I know that there were some people who asked questions and we didn't get to them, and I apologize. I think we need to have like a couple more folks fielding it. There were so many of you here, which was really awesome. Thank you. It looked like at one point there was over 100 people, and I know there were folks watching on YouTube, and there were about 300 people who were registered, that means interested in the recording and all that. So I just want to thank you for listening to my voice for a really long time. And hopefully I didn't alarm anybody. Those of you who have been working on Move to Amend for 10 years, I just want to make clear that your work has been so important and has brought us to where we are now. And what I want to do is figure out how to maximize it and make sure that we're figuring out how to go forward in the most powerful way possible. So I hope nothing that I said made it sound like I don't think we should have been doing what we've been doing for the last 10 years. I just think that we need to make sure that we stay as relevant as possible because we're running out of time. And it kills me how many organizations out there just continue to do what they have been doing because that's what they've been doing. And that's what their donors expect from them. And that's what there's, and it's like a job. So that's what their staff are, just kind of, and there's not really any sort of like, wait a minute, what are we building towards? And given what's happening right now, is this what makes sense? At the same time, there's also lots of other groups that just sort of like issue hop. And that's not what I'm proposing that we do either, and that's part of what I think has been something that we can be proud of in terms of integrity over these last 10 years, that we weren't just one of the groups that jumped in on Citizens United because that was the thing that everybody was outraged about that week. And then the next year it turned into something else. And those groups are now nowhere to be seen on this issue that supposedly was so fundamental, right? To me, this is all the same conversation. And we absolutely still need to end corporate personhood, but we also need to save our planet. And part of why we felt as though corporate personhood was a strategic linchpin is because we're not going to be able to hold fossil fuel corporations accountable until they don't have rights under the Constitution. But at the same time, our government doesn't give a shit. And so what are we going to do about that, right? We need a different government. And so that's what I really want us to figure out is like, is this the best way to get a different government? And whatever is the best way, let's do it. All right, thanks everybody for joining me. I was really honored to have you here, and you can find me on social media under my full name if you don't already know me. So if you want to continue the conversation that way, let's do it. And then also if you're not already signed up on Move to Amend's list, like that would be the best way to be in the loop about where we go with this. Have a really good night, everyone. Stay safe out there and take care of each other. Good night.